not merely to tackle the crises that the Trump administration created, but to fix the stuff that was really messed up before he even started. Lastly, here in California, and these are numbers as of yesterday, California counted 15.5 million votes, more than 10% of all the votes cast for president countrywide. We have about 2.7 million more votes uncounted, plus whatever votes are in the mail, which are valid as long as they're postmarked by election day and received by registrars on November 20th. So we still don't know, we still in California don't have all the votes that were cast in the hands of registrars. Thus far, turnout is about 70%. And with at least those votes, it could go up to 81%. So just want to say that this kind of deep and wide voter participation in an election where California's contribution to the top of the ticket was never in doubt is a great testament to the many types of voter engagement and actually resident engagement that we have and that we fund here in California, not just in this cycle, but that we've been doing for the last decade or two. So I really want to trumpet the work that folks have been doing to get us to between 70 to 80% voter turnout. With that, I want to pass it to Aimee Allison. Aimee Allison, 1, is fantastic. 2, amazing. 3, she's the founder and president of She the People. That's a national network elevating the voice and power of women of color. She brings together voters, organizers, and elected leaders in a movement grounded in values of love, justice, belonging, and democracy. In 2018, Ms. Allison was one of the primary architects of the Year of Women of Color in Politics. And look what happened in 2020. You got to start early, make things happen. And Aimee did that. In April 2019, she convened the first presidential forum for women of color, reaching a quarter of the American population. A democratic innovator and visionary, Ms. Allison leads national efforts to build inclusive, multiracial coalitions led by women of color. She leverages media, research, and analysis to increase voter engagement and advocate for racial, economic, and gender justice. So I'm really proud and honored to have Aimee with us. So Aimee, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ludovic, and thank you to all the organizers for including me in this conversation. This is a proud moment. It's a proud moment to be a Black woman. It's a proud moment to be a Black woman in California. And I want to tell you that my organizing that Ludovic described started in the wake of the 2016 election, in which Black women and Black voters, who are 25% of the Democratic Party base, were not a calculus to win. We weren't prioritized. Our leadership and issues were not front and center. Our numbers, those who were vote eligible, as well as those who consistently come to the polls to uphold Democratic Party wins up and down the ballot, were not a talking point for the so-called experts on cable news. And yet, 4 years later, a California Black woman, a woman of color from California, is headed to the White House, and Black women are the MVPs of the 2020 election. And I can't overstate the difference that 2020 is for the potential of Black people leading a broad, inclusive multiracial coalition to transform American politics and lead us out of the dark years of the Trump era and all of the neglect and ignoring of our issues that have preceded those years. And I just want to express my gratitude to everyone who was part of that. You know, I think you're right, Ludovic. I think people moved very quickly on Monday morning to, woe is me. I don't even, people who had misunderstood the dynamic of the race. Black people, and I'm going to share some statistics. We already heard a few already. Black people were the powerhouse that led to victories in the swing states. And She the People and is a multiracial women of color movement led by Black women who organized tirelessly for this moment, this possibility. I was looking at some photographs from our presidential forum. We had Kamala Harris on stage along with 7 other presidential primary contenders back in early 2019. And we talked about issues that were important to Black women back then, interjecting them into the national conversation, like Black maternal health, like the issue of domestic workers and servers being paid sub-minimum wage, climate justice, a lot of the issues that we care about and organize on the ground. But we also did a series of listening sessions and a very public pressure campaign to make sure that a Black woman was on the top of the ticket. We knew we needed that for high turnout. We heard it from the organizers on the ground in terms of enthusiasm. We had the numbers and we delivered. So I want us to celebrate the fact that particularly women of color and Black voters, both in California and nationally, have, there's no turning back, that we have demonstrated our power as voters and we are ready to govern. And that is a tremendous, tremendous place that we find ourselves in. And the question is, what do we do with that right now? And how do we capitalize on it? Where do we invest in order to strengthen our position in order to govern? So I want to take a moment to talk about that and to talk about what the possibilities are in conversation with these amazing panelists. With Kamala Harris, our Vice President-elect, heading to the White House, it is for sure, particularly you could see her tweets and her direct messaging, particularly to Black women, that our voices, our issues will be heard and represented as never before. And one thing that we need to take a lead on, and we take a note from the great Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who spent 10 years flipping Georgia based on maximizing the power of Black voters, really deeply investing in year-round organizers with a whole network of a multiracial set of network of organizers to register voters, fight voter suppression, et cetera. We do see that ending this reign of voter suppression that's really setting up a situation where white voters who are overwhelmingly Republican can suppress our vote, our power, and enact policies that hurt our communities. So in order for our democracy to work, we have to lean in and lean in quickly in the first 100 days of this new administration and at every level, protecting our democracy and expanding the playbook that Stacey Abrams has put in place to other states. And when it comes to the transition team, as we look to governance, we want to see Black leadership and issues supported at every level. And there's really good indications, at least very early on, that that's happening. Yesterday, the Biden-Harris Transition Committee released the list of those assigned to its agency review teams. This is something we need to keep an eye on in terms of positioning ourselves for governance. Of the 40 agency review teams, 11 are Black, including 7 Black women leading state, commerce, education, EPA, Health and Human Services, Social Security, and USAID. We've never seen this before, our level of leadership in the transition. And we're going to take a deeper look at the composition of the teams to ensure the representation is there. But with 30% of the team being Black, I hope that you will agree that this Biden-Harris transition team's off to a very positive start, and we have to make sure that we invest in the momentum, the public pressure, and the institutions that will make sure that we are in place in the administration. If we look back to the role that women of color played, we can look at early vote numbers. When we say Black women were the MVP of flipping Georgia, it's not just Georgia. When we started our organizing, we understood that Black women, as well as other women of color, had the vote eligible numbers in order to close the gap and flip states that Trump won in 2016 to blue. And that was based on very hard, mostly underappreciated, underacknowledged work on the ground for organizers. If there's a lesson for 2020, it is that it wasn't coming from the party or committees, but often independently funded and organized Black and Brown-led efforts that expanded the electorate and that valued people that were dismissed as low propensity in past elections, that the old strategy of going to Black voters and other voters of color in the last 6 weeks is a losing strategy, that we're the swing voters. We're the ones that the campaigns and the party cannot take for granted. So when we look nationally at the way that Black women showed up, 92% of Black women voted for a Biden-Harris ticket. 86% of Black men supported Biden. And that 6-point difference is very important for us to understand and address in the coming years, to understand that there isn't a monolith among Black voters when it comes to gender differences, but the Democrats can depend on Black women to carry and push forward the core of the vote. In every single one of the swing states that She the People focused on, which includes Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Texas, Wisconsin, and Nevada, Black women voted a tremendously high, north of 90% for the Biden-Kamala Harris ticket. And then when we look at Georgia, as a result of all of the years of work and investment, it really required leaders like Stacey Abrams to go to donors and say, we have a path to turning blue, and it requires you to toss away old expectations about what voice and what vote and what leadership is gonna do this thing. Who lives in Georgia and where? And she fully maximized voting in not only urban areas of Atlanta, but if you look at Black turnout in Gwinnett and some of the other counties in the suburban ring around Atlanta, as well as the rural areas in southern Georgia, it's impressive. And Black women voting over 2016, a 58% increase, and drove the results. In a place like in a place like Pennsylvania, Black women turned out higher than the rest of the voters at 8%. So I say that to say the lesson is to invest in Black-led organizing and leadership to be able to have this tremendous national impact, and to underscore really moving into the leadership positions both at the national level and the state level. We'll be supporting Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight, New Georgia Project, Glow Vote, and a number of Asian Americans Advancing Justice and others as we go into a runoff for the Georgia Senate. The final thing I want to pay attention to is, now that Kamala Harris is moving into the White House, we won't have a Black woman in Senate. And we need to have the third Black woman in the US Senate. So I hope you will join with me in both funding and investing in efforts so that we end up with a Barbara Lee, or there's been a couple other names focused, that'll be our next senator from California. It's tremendously important that we have that voice in the US Senate. I want to thank you all for this opportunity to share with you.
Thank you very much, Aimee. Yes, exciting work. It's been building for a long time, and we're not done, but we got to a significant place. So thank you so much for getting us here. Next, we're going to dive into the proposition, some of the key proposition results here in California. Everyone knows that the presidential race obviously was the most expensive race in the country. The next set of most expensive races were actually California's propositions. And altogether, we usually spend as much in California on propositions as the entire presidential race costs. So our initiative races cost a lot of money. So we're going to highlight a handful of those key races. First, we're going to start with Proposition 15 with Christina Livingston, who is the executive director of the Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment, ACE. She's been organizing since 2004, when she was brought on as an organizer for Los Angeles Acorn. In 2010, Christina helped form ACE Action and ACE Institute, where she worked for 2 years as statewide deputy director before becoming executive director. In her organizing career, Christina has worked on campaigns that address equitable infrastructure investment, progressive revenue solutions, housing equity, access to high quality and well-funded public services, good government, and criminal justice. She views her work from the intersection of racial and economic impacts and is passionate about centering the voices of people of color, poor folks, and women. So join me in thanking Christina, and let's hear about Prop 15. Christina?
Thanks, Ludovic. So many of you know that Prop 15 reform has been, or Prop 13 reform, which this year was on the ballot as Prop 15, has been a labor of love and struggle for folks in the organizing community here in California for really a decade or more. Certainly my early years of organizing with Acorn, there were conversations about reforming Prop 13 then, and there was real planning and dedication to get to where we were, for this election, which included figuring out what is the greatest pathway to success. How are we going to raise enough money, knowing that this is going to be an expensive initiative, as they always are, how we were going to split the opposition, how we would really build enough of a coalition of influence to talk to the level of voters that we needed to talk to. How are we going to build out the infrastructure needed to do the really systematic door knocking and phoning? And that is what led to the Schools and Communities First Coalition that helped put Prop 15 on the ballot and did the work this year. And unfortunately, we didn't see the win at the end of it, but we came really, really close. And with hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into the race, and with us sort of basically our ground game was significantly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. We know that with our work through the Million Voters Project and our work in our individual organizations, that our strength is in our ability to get in front of people face to face and have the conversation that not only moves them, but encourages them and gives them the tools that they need to move other folks. And we didn't quite have that. That was harmful for the campaign, obviously. But there were a couple of other really critical things that were harmful for the campaign. One of those is that year after year, we have seen the increased influence of corporate dollars in our initiative processes, and they are recognizing that they can't actually win by putting forward their arguments. And so what they've started to do is take our exact arguments. If you want to make sure that we protect small businesses, you should vote no on Prop 15, despite the fact that Prop 15 was actually going to help protect small businesses and went after the larger corporations to get them to pay their fair share, to put money into our schools, our communities, actually to help bolster our small businesses. But they use that exact wording and exact framing, and instead of saying vote yes on Prop 15, they said vote no on Prop 15. And the amount of money they're able to raise was able to get them in front of more eyes and ears. So that's obviously really damaging on our end, and we've got to figure out how to contend with that. The other thing that we saw, and that we've also seen in the past, was an ability to co-opt our known institutions. And I will just say here that for Black folks, there are a few institutions that we look to that have historically stood up for us. And over, what we've seen in the past couple of election cycles is that, folks like Alice Huffman are willing to take the contracts from the no side. And that happens, right around the time that the statewide NAACP takes the opposing view of what, folks like us on the community have put forward, and then receives substantial contracts to go out and say, NAACP is against this and you should be too, and it's bad for the Black community. And I don't say that to say that, Black people are a monolith and we would all agree that Prop 15 is the right solution. I do say that to say that there is a very clear line of a vested financial interest in taking that position. And there have been several questions raised by local chapters of the NAACP as to how those decisions are made. They are not consulted. So the savviness of the opposition to use our trusted organizations against us in a fight that sounds confusing over the television waves and the airwaves, is also something we really need to work through, because representation is important, but we know that not all representation is actually like standing up uninfluenced by money and putting forward what is a impartial analysis about what the Black community needs. And then the last thing I will say is that there are some really deeply permeated beliefs held in California and amongst Black folks that still work against us, despite the fact that they have not shown up to be true for us over and over again. That includes the belief of rugged individualism. That includes the belief of a meritocracy that folks believe.
I'm sorry, you got 1 minute.
Okay, let me stop soapboxing and get to the point. But that folks really do believe that if just given the opportunity, they can excel. And that also gets used, and we have to be very clear about telling the real story. So just to say on the back end, what we're thinking about now is austerity cuts will be coming down. And we don't have Prop 15 money that's going to come rolling in. So we need to figure out how we are moving wealth tax or millionaires tax so that we can fund what our communities need to keep each other safe and strong. And I want to say that it is very difficult. Many of us who do this organizing work, the civic engagement work, are able to really ramp up and talk to hundreds of thousands of people in that space between September and November. But then we have to shrink back down to the couple thousand people that we work with more closely. And I think we've got to figure out how we can fund and maintain both levels, where we're talking deeply and building the base of those few thousand who are sort of really core and front and center in the work, but constantly actually talking about and politicizing and exposing what is the real agenda of the opposite side to the hundreds of thousands of people that we're able to talk to in the election cycle. We can't do the boom and bust anymore. Thanks, Ludovic.
Thank you, Christina. And we see your questions. Put questions either in the chat or the Q&A, and we will come back around. I'll ask the speakers to look at those two things. We're going to move to Dr. Elisha Smith Arrillaga, who serves as the Executive Director of the Education Trust West, a research and advocacy organization focused on educational justice and supporting the high achievement of all California students, with a particular focus on underserved students of color, low-income students, and English learners. She leads the organization's work centering education as a key racial and economic justice issue, and has extensive expertise in leading initiatives using multiple strategies for impacting state policy, leveraging direct action, research, media, and policymaker engagement. She has more than 20 years experience working in and partnering with education, workforce, policy, research, and advocacy organizations, including Career Ladders Project, First 5 LA, the Hewlett Foundation, and high schools and community colleges across California. All right, come on in, Elisha.
All right, well, thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk about Prop 16. And Prop 16, like Prop 15, unfortunately, was unsuccessful this November. And, I think the failure of both measures together is really problematic, because Prop 15 was really about adequate funding for education, and Prop 16 in many ways was about equitable funding. And what Californians decided to do this November was to do neither at this particular moment. And one of the reasons that it's especially problematic, and I think there's still hope, which I'll talk a little bit more about towards the end, but both of these measures really came from communities. So back in March, or actually back in January of this year, we at Trust West were approached by Dr. Shirley Weber, who Dr. Weber had been approached actually by students the previous year, who said, they were on UC and CSU campuses across the state of California, students of color, who came to her and said, Prop 209 is really making our campuses an uncomfortable place to be. And we really think that something should be done, and Prop 209 should be repealed. And so Dr. Weber really listened to the voices of these students and came to us because she saw a policy window earlier this year to really try and put repealing Prop 209, which was the ban on affirmative action. She saw an opportunity to try and strike that down. And so we worked really closely with Dr. Weber, and actually the press conference announcing what was then ACA 5, which was the bill to put Prop 16 on the ballot, That press conference was held on March 13th. And actually, it was the last trip that I took pre-COVID. And it was actually the day that many schools that day after closed for in-person instruction. And so you have both, this historic moment of ACA 5 being introduced at the same moment where COVID is ramping up. And there are a lot of questions about what that's going to mean for the state. And even through that, the hearings that were held around ACA 5, initially there were a lot of folks when we said, hey, we're going to join Dr. Weber in this fight and we're going to help lead this fight. There are people who say, hey, people have been trying to repeal Prop 209 and bring back affirmative action to California for a long time. Like, there's no way that could be successful. Why do it now? And, in addition to the voices of students that really led Dr. Weber to make that choice, there was some preliminary polling data that showed it was definitely a road to making Prop 16 or repealing affirmative action be a possibility. And so there were some historic moments between March and June. ACA 5 passed through the committee hearings, with actually support from both Republicans and Democrats. The murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. The hearings around ACA 5 were happening at this moment where, we know that racism is not new, but it was just so people could no longer deny it. And so you had Republicans on the Senate floor making speeches in favor of ACA 5 and bringing back affirmative action so that we had an extra tool in our COVID recovery in California. And so the success of ACA 5 led to Prop 16 being able to be put on the ballot. But of course, that happened in June. And so, what Prop 15 had a few years of organizing to do on the ground, Prop 16 essentially had 4 months to make people aware that this was even an issue that was on the ballot and to really rally support around it. One of the most amazing things about the campaign is that even in those short 4 months, the campaign was able to raise $20 million in support of Proposition 16. And, in addition to a lot of endorsements by celebrities and sports figures and others. But one of the really interesting things too is that a lot of that funding actually came from some of the same folks who opposed Prop 15. Which just further highlights how there were, a couple of really key issues that led to the failure of Prop 16. I mean, first and foremost, we know that, Prop 16 and bringing back affirmative action and the way that it was described on the ballot was actually, the ballot language was very confusing for folks. And so that was one thing that was really problematic. Secondly, we also know that the entire, all the organizing for Prop 16 happened within the context of COVID. So being able to go out, be in person, make sure that folks really understood the message, we were really unable to do that as well. And then if we look at the election results, the counties where Prop 16 was successful were only in the Bay Area and LA. And actually that's where a lot of the dollars in terms of ads were really focused. And so it also gives me some hope to think about, well, what if there was more time and more energy that had been devoted to actually educating the rest of the state around what Prop 16 was really about? And, I think there's just a longer conversation that we need to have as a state about what does it really mean to support a diverse state, not only in our rhetoric, but in our actions. And the failures of Prop 15 and Prop 16 show that there's a lot of progressive rhetoric in California, but we really need to do some deep organizing to help folks understand how that rhetoric can actually match the actions that we take to make sure that every student in California has equal opportunity. So I look forward to talking more today, and I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks very much. All right. So we're going to cover the last initiative we're doing a deep dive on with Dorsey Nunn, who's a leading expert with over 40 years of professional experience in criminal justice reform. He's the first formerly incarcerated director of a public interest law office in California. Dorsey was sentenced to life in the California Department of Corrections when he was 19 years old. He was paroled in 1981 and discharged from parole in 1984. Under his leadership, LSPC has made significant advances, including the development of the Elder Freeman Policy Fellowship, legal victories, including the Ashker lawsuit, which ended long-term solitary confinement in California, and policy victories, including numerous ban-the-box laws passed at the local, state, and federal levels, the ending of shackling of pregnant women, and the biggest drug sentencing reform passed by the California legislature in recent history, SB 180. Dorsey has received federal and local recognition, including the White House Champion of Change Award, signed by President Obama, and the Certificate of Special Congressional Recognition by Nancy Pelosi. Dorsey, please run us through your initiative. Some good news. And you are muted. He's teasing y'all. This is the one that won. All right, you should be.
All right. For me, first of all, I'm very honored to be here because a lot of times we talk about criminal justice issues and we stand outside of the family and the circle when we have these discussions. I seen every woman on the screen light up when you talked about Kamala's victory. How do we fit in terms of having a part of our community that's emerging? How do we get to the table and actually be respected at the table? Proposition 17 was more than just a question of what we did with this election cycle, because some of us started our fight in 2000 when the issue was felony disenfranchisement on the Gore-Bush debacle. Then we went into probably 2012 when we still had felony disenfranchisement on the table. And in 2012, voter suppression took the form of voter ID in the election of Barack Obama on the second term. About time that we get to California about Proposition 17, some of us stayed at home because we really wanted to expand our rights. And we also wanted to expand the number of people who get specifically engaged about making decisions, particularly in Black and Brown communities, because we were being absolutely excluded. So when it came to Proposition 17, which we started to write the vote for 50,000 people on parole, we thought that was a tremendous victory. But that victory falls short in terms of what the actual victory was, because formerly incarcerated people learned how to run their own campaigns. So we know how to take it through the legislature at this point. We know how to actually to get into streets and actually pass laws. That's something that we didn't have access to, because generally other people only seeing us as clients, as opposed to people seeking self-determination on how to advance a cause. You know, so at a certain point, what we learned how to do is that we placed ads in the newspaper. And what made the ads is for everybody else really distinctive, because we had the Michelle Alexanders, the Dolores Huertas, the Angeles David sign on the ad. But for me, the most remarkable thing that was on that ad was the bottom line. Formerly incarcerated people paid for this ad themselves. You know, that was a remarkable statement, but I think it got past a whole bunch of people. And we ran it 3 times before it was a proposition, it was ACCE 6. When we got deeper into the fight, what we learned how to do is that along the way, we hustled and we sent text messages to 300,000 people. We called 50,000 people. We stood in front of countless stores and in parks and gave people free masks that said, let all people vote. We had probably touched better than 1 million people when they called it impressions. With the Sacramento Bee, it was 369,000 impressions. We took impressions out with Spotify. We took expression out with Pandora, and we started putting out messages. In addition to that, we started actually tailoring our own stuff. We started hiring a firm to actually help us do editorials and to push out. You got a segment, I think, of the Black community that's on fire, but I don't even know if Black people recognize that you got a segment of the Black community that's on fire for justice. You know, so every presidential candidate probably this time around saying that they gonna take up criminal justice issues and they need criminal justice reform. They did not get there by themselves. It was organizing that helped them get to this point. So here's an example when we talk about formerly incarcerated people. We expanded the voting pool probably, how about this? We changed the Constitution in 3 states over the last 3 years. 17 makes California the 3rd state. We did it in Louisiana when they did the unanimous jury verdict. So 12 people can judge a person guilty as opposed to 10. And in Florida, we tried to incorporate 1.4 million people when we actually fought for a Proposition 4. So it was 2 and 4 that happened in 2018. This time around, we went down and we did 50,000. So for us, is how do we expand the number of people who get the opportunity to vote? And that's different because we still got work to do. Is how do you do the political education that make them want to vote? Because we're not voting for the same people that we see at the pool hall. We don't know the people that we're voting for. And we think that a lot of those people don't know us either. You know, so how do you influence them? So we're going to need resources to not only secure the victory and the right to vote, we're going to need resources on how you actually go out and get out to vote in this particular community. Because I think that is really essential that we take that next step that's there. And in terms of this election cycle nationally, I know that the formerly incarcerated, convicted people and family movement is already examined on how do we reach into Alabama. I know what we learned on this journey, that some of the people around us in California will be looking at, take that back, be looking at how do we focus on places like Atlanta. And we beginning to focus on how do we do that particular type of work and reach out and use a national apparatus. One of the things that was helpful for the formerly incarcerated people in the state of California was All of Us are None, because we had chapters in every major city stretching from San Diego to just a little bit north of here. And I'm in the Bay Area. So we had people that was out there doing work in San Diego, Riverside, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Sacramento, Oakland and San Francisco. We had that kind of reach, you know, and we had did that kind of organizing as grassroots organizing. I wish I could say that we had a whole abundance of resources that we could throw at this proposition. But the reality of it is that we are Legal Services for Prisoners with Children is not a 501c4. We are 501c3, which it only enables us to use 20% of our resources in our budget to engage in political activity. So like one of the stuff that's there for us was that in 2018, you know, through the help of other people, we was able to purchase a building and we became landlords. And in purchasing that building, we generated rent. So for the unrestricted funds that we generated as a result of having a building, then we could take those proceeds and invest it in how do we fight back and how do we secure our votes. So one of the things that happened was that we took out radio ads in 5 areas that we was running 3 times a day. The other thing that we put on the ad was this ad is being paid for by Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, an organization that's being led by a formerly incarcerated person. We didn't add that part of it. You know, what we also did is we went out and secured the support of named people to help accent the stories that we want to get out. So we went out and we did outreach, and we got Dolores Huerta to sign on to the campaign. We got Danny Glover to sign on to the campaign. We got Michelle Alexander to sign on to the campaign. And we got John Legend. So all these things that I'm telling you is what we are learning, and we are hungry, and we're eating up a lot of space while we're running forward and learning. You know, the real question probably is that I think that I wrote an article and I sent it to a number of people. Will people see our 50,000 votes that we just acquired, because we had acquired another 60,000 votes in 2015 in California? This is the second time. So we expanded the voting pool by at least 110,000 people. will the Black and brown community see this as our gift to the Black and brown community, because we're trying to engage, because they can't do anything to your children without doing it to mine. So how do we actually support the leadership in this segment of our community in a real distinctive way, where we can actually do something besides pass the right, but not necessarily turn out the people to vote? Because I think that the question right now is that we just got finished having a victory with Proposition 17. How do we get around to really implementing it and making it meaningful to formerly incarcerated people in our communities? And I think that it's going to take formerly incarcerated people to carry that message, because generally when we're fighting for the right to vote, we're not even fighting for the right to vote for formerly incarcerated people to hold public offices. We're generally fighting for the right to vote for other people to hold office. So we got particular messaging that we got to carve out in order to motivate people to actually get out there and actually fight in a real particular way and vote in a real particular way. And, you know, so we asking that people actually think about that question. And once again, man, I'm really grateful to be able to have this conversation, because I think that is an important part of what we do. And to have this a conversation with Black folks, I really need to tell you that you got a segment of your community that's hungry, and we knocking on doors all over this country. You know, will our community let us in and actually share what we've learned? Because some of this stuff we want to share. And for, you know, nobody knocked on my door and said, will you help on a number of propositions that we should have been able to help on, because we had a statewide apparatus in California.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to try to get us back on time. So thank you, Dorsey.
Thank you.
I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about other races below the state initiatives. Some will be local initiatives, some will be state, some will be candidate races. The election is over. Me sharing this information is not partisan because it already happened. And I'm sharing this information because some of the successes and failures in the candidate space have impacts on Black folks, and Black funders need to think about how they're going to invest, especially around the wins. So I'm going to start off first. Unlike the state initiatives, the candidate races outcomes were between a good to great, especially with local races. First one I want to spotlight is the district attorney race in LA. And everybody understands California politics are complicated. So in that race, we had George Gascon running against the incumbent Black woman Democrat, Jackie Lacey, who's one of the worst DAs in the country. Through another hat of the California donor table, we were able to fund the Black women-led independent expenditure for her at about for George Gascon against Jackie Lacey, at about $2.6 million for Black woman-led, Black, Latinx, API, Muslim community centered independent expenditure for Gascon, and Gascon won. Gascon is a progressive reformer, and he's already engaging with a lot of the groups to figure out what kind of governing strategies they need to do in the upcoming years. Second election update I want to do is Holly Mitchell, where we also funded at about $1.4 million in independent expenditure run by some of the same Black women and some of the same community groups to have her win for the LA County Board of Supervisors. It was disappointing that a Black Lives Matter leader endorsed Herb Wesson, who was also endorsed by the cops. So that was a concerning piece on that. I'm sharing that with UC3 funders as you all are investing in folks to think about these things. And now the LA Board of Supervisors is all women, and Holly Mitchell's on it. Another outcome, San Diego went from a 4-to-1 right-wing majority to a 3-to-2 progressive majority. That is huge. That's our state's second largest county. And to go from right-wing leadership to not just Democratic leadership, but actually progressive leadership is key. And so folks, when you're thinking about funding, there's going to be a lot more opportunities for progressive governance at the county level in San Diego, where there's a lot of Black folks. African-American woman Rhodesia Ransom is ahead to bring the San Joaquin Board of Supervisors to a moderate Democratic majority. So that's great. And then we also, with that other hat, endorsed some state legislative candidates that went well. Some concerns that I'd flag: African-American progressive Stockton Mayor Michael Stubbs is behind right-wing Republican, the right-wing Republican African-American candidate, whose name I do not remember, but that's something to watch out for. And also, although sadly, I think the Black population in Orange County is less than 1%, the Orange County Board of Supervisors remained 4-1 right-wing Republican dominated. Local initiative results were pretty good, especially on criminal justice reform. In LA, a strong criminal justice measure passed, requiring 10% of the budget to go to community investments and alternatives to incarceration. In San Diego, again, the second largest county in the state, I always feel like I need to remind folks, they passed the state's strongest independent police review commission. So that's a great outcome. There was a very strong environmental measure in Long Beach, taxing oil to fund racial justice programs in Long Beach, which is fantastic. There was youth voting for school board members initiative passing in Oakland. And in San Francisco, there were several local initiatives around small business relief, rent relief, and a second in the nation disproportionate CEO pay tax. So that is something like, if the CEO makes more than 25 times the lowest paid worker, you pay a low tax rate. If the CEO makes 100 times the lowest one, you pay a higher tax rate. If they make above 500 times the lowest paid one, you pay an even higher tax rate. So as we're thinking of how to capture the revenues from this additional wave of robber barons, that San Francisco initiative is something really to wrap our heads around. Want to cover some additional propositions. Speaking of tech robber barons, Prop 22, which added app workers to the existing labor carve-outs that currently exist from farm workers and domestic workers, Prop 22 passed. Just a reminder, those previous carve-outs, when during the New Deal, when they were making worker protections, the two industries that were carved out were farm workers, because they're Black and brown men and women, and domestic workers because they were Black and brown women. And those were the two industries that were carved out from the regular worker protections. California just added a third worker sector, which are these app workers. And we'll see what the race and gender makeup of those app workers becomes now that they are the third industry that's carved out of traditional worker protections. Also want to flag that rent control failed again. Lastly, the congressional races had relatively bad outcomes. There were right-wing candidates that won in 1, 2, 3. There were about 4 or 5 new districts where right-wing candidates won. And so that's important to just keep in mind. I think that's all the candidate and local initiative and some state initiative stuff I wanted to cover. We're now basically on time, going to move to Q&A and some conversation amongst the panelists. So first, please, everybody, continue to put your questions in the chat. And then as you're doing that, we're going to turn to questions amongst the panelists. So I guess I'd kick off by saying, hey, California is supposed to be a progressive jurisdiction with lots of people of color, and we have super majorities of Democrats. Why are we leading the nation on progressive policies? And if not, why not? And who wants to? I think I'm going to go with Christina first on that.
Thanks for that big question, Ludovic. Actually, just because you were shouting out some folks who won, I just want to say that ACE is really proud that our Oakland director is now on the Oakland City Council, making that a progressive city council, in addition to some ACE folks being on the city council in Richmond, and our folks being on the rent board in Berkeley. So one thing to say is, despite what happened at the statewide level, at the local level in lots of places, we saw really progressive folks being elected who have really progressive politics, who have been working deeply and for a long time with community. and you know, our folks who we talk to all the time, like they know what's up, they know what time it is. It is the case, as I was mentioning before, though, that there are so many people that we're not able to go deep with everywhere. And we are, if anyone thinks that, you know, just because we knew hundreds of $millions would be spent meant that we should be ready for it, that is living in a non-reality. California continues to be as progressive as it was before, which is to say we all always knew that there were real problems in this state that needed to be addressed. I think we're actually like starting to reckon with some of the racial tensions that have existed here and some of the like structural policy violence that has been inflicted upon people of color and Black people in particular. We are starting to reckon with it. And we're seeing that with things that are starting to move through the legislature and things that are starting to move on the ground. But the reality is the supermajority, as we all know, has always been a majority of that supermajority of folks who would be, you know, in the Democratic Party are really influenced by corporate dollars. So while people's politics might be more progressive, the influence of corporate money just cannot be denied. And that is where we have to really work in the non-election cycles to sort of really like separate and start to highlight what that really means, what that agenda means, and how we're sort of taking care of each other. Because I want to say in a pandemic moment where we really do have to take care of each other, allowing this influence of corporate power to just continue to influence the agenda will mean that more and more of us will suffer in these years. And so we've got real work ahead of us.
Do other folks want to weigh in on that? What should we expect from a supermajority Democratic leadership, and what do we do about the gap on your issue?
For me, what I think should supermajority state of Democrats mean is that we shouldn't continue to hold people in prison and don't call them slaves when we got in our state constitution the use of the term involuntary servitude. So we shouldn't be made invisible when we got an ugly practice. Stuff that we ask among ourselves, is it any better to be a slave of the state or a slave of a private corporation? In the state of California, we're still holding slaves, but nobody's calling it such. In our constitution read that makes it allowable. And how do we fight and hold up some of the things? I think that we're in a very important moment. And if we don't grab what's on the table right now that make the progress that we need as Black and brown people right now, and particularly Black people, we could be getting a backlash that's coming if they still got 70 million people out there with an attitude. We can actually assume that it's going to come. So if we're not grabbing space right now and picking the things that we can pick off right now, we'll be fighting hard for them later.
All right. Let me ask everybody on the panel, who did Cedric Brown asked about the state, since the state NAACP seems compromised, what organizations can lead and advise on Black community specific policy advocacy? So I'm going to turn that question to each of you, but let me just ask, Dorsey, did the NAACP, state NAACP endorse your initiative?
No, our relationship has been a little bit silly all the time, and I need to say that. So like you asking about the initiative, and the real question of it is, have they actually stood up and supported formerly incarcerated in any real meaningful way? Because like, you know, whether it was a ban the box that kept saying, what did the NAACP think? If they thought about it real hard, I wouldn't have to fight it. So I don't know what to tell you when you ask me the question about where they're at. And if I'm going to be dependent upon them, I probably will be standing out there without any clothes, starving. So I'm not going to wait for them to actually support that for me.
Hang on one second. I'm just asking a simple question. Did they endorse your initiative? Because I'm going to ask each person.
Okay.
So,
I didn't feel it.
You didn't know? Okay. How about you, Doctor? Did they endorse your initiative? You might be frozen.
Elisha's having some technical difficulties.
Oh, gotcha. And Christina, they were on the other side on your initiative.
Right. They opposed 15 and they opposed 21, which we were also
Gotcha.
going for.
So since they're compromised, what organizations can lead and advise on Black community specific stuff? Christina?
I really think it's regional. You know, our communities are local, and there are organizations in each region that people really look to. And what we need to do the work of is actually connecting our regional, like, Black influencers to come up with what our political agenda is. And I know that there's appetite out there for that. And we, as a sort of community of folks in the organizing world, need to really like dig in and figure out how to make space and to have that sort of resourced so that we can like get aligned around what it is that's good for our community.
Gotcha. Allison, I have a question. Aimee, got a question for you around how you see the lessons learning between California, where we had explicit white supremacist governance from Pete Wilson and all the propositions, and us digging out of that, to newer places that are working to dig out of that, whether that's Georgia or Texas or these other places that are poised to do that, and the country. What are the lessons that you think we can share, and what are the lessons that we can learn from other places?
I mean, one of the things we saw in 2020 is that when you look at the Black vote, you're really looking at Gen Z and millennial vote with a marked increase. I think our leadership's going to come from those generations, and we have to have explicitly find and elevate those voices. You know, the turning point for us in California had a lot to do with work that probably some of you in the calls, if you were active back then, in automatic voter registration, tying it to the DMV, and some of those changes to expand democracy, which then fueled a supermajority. Those are the kinds of fundamental structural changes that need to happen in places like Georgia, Florida, Texas, Arizona, the places that are kind of the front edge. The challenge that we have in California is that we have to have a complex way of understanding. It can't simply be for any of the ways that we organize based on race or based on gender, because it's based on values. And how do we organize based on values and a set of voices that we can elevate? I think we have to in California invest deeply in our high potential leaders who can express the values that we stand for, the transformation that we want to fight for in the state, and knows how to pull the levers of power to be able to put the right people and pass the right legislation. If we go back to organizations such as NAACP that has leadership that's not committed to the issues of justice in our community, then we need to really build up and elevate the voices and the organizations that will.
That mute button. I got one more question for everybody, which is, what are the organizing groups? Actually, I'd add, what are the organizing and advocacy groups? All the groups can't meet in person, right? So the only group I think that is meeting in person is the state legislature. But anybody trying to impact the state legislature cannot be actually meeting with them. So what are organizing and advocacy groups doing in their approaches during COVID? Like, how has the work changed? And given that it might be another year with this kind of quarantine stuff, how do you see the next year, your work changing? Yeah, a lot of Zoom calls. Only we had told y'all to invest in Zoom a year ago, we would have fixed the like economic issues and progressive nonprofits. So dang it. But how has your approach changed now?
My approach changed because I'm very much more aware of other stuff that's happening all around the country as a result of COVID-19. The Zoom that made me reach out in ways to other people. So like when you ask that last question, what I already know is that they didn't remove the use of slavery out of 2 constitutions this last election cycle. I think they changed the flag for Mississippi. They took out the Confederate flag as part of their flag. I think when it came to Rhode Island, what they did, Rhode Island was also had in the name of their state, the use of the term plantation. So I can see some of the stuff that's being struggled with nationally that have a very much to do with the end of slavery and the end of Jim Crow. And people are attacking those things in various ways in various places. So I can see that as a result of the Zoom calls, that we're reaching out in a much more fundamental way. So it's like, I already know that we're going to be asked to do hustle for in Georgia. I already know that people are meeting probably on Friday talking about how do we get to this segment of the community and carry messages to let them know that their votes are important and the community needs those votes. So for us, it's Zoom calls made it possible for us to meet in a much more different way. I used to drag maybe 400 to 500 people for our Quest for Democracy annually. Last year we did it digitally, so we're learning the use of the technology in a much more rapid way than we would have been forced to do if we were still dependent upon moving buses around California. So it actually advanced the way that we actually start acquiring knowledge about the technology in a much different way. So it has impacted us and we're learning it.
Christina or Elisha?
Yeah, I would just add to one of the things that we're seeing is the use of data is even more important. Like when there are moments when before we would be working with partners to have 400, 500, 600 people in person in front of the legislature, we've had to figure out, well, how do we recreate that? And so when the legislature actually was not on Zoom, but only taking phone calls, we had people flooding the phone lines, right? And that was really effective. The other thing that we've done is we've tried to do regular polling, both by phone in partnership with other organizations and other kinds of polling of parents and students and families to make sure that when there are committee hearings or other things, that those voices are still present. So I think there are a lot of creative and innovative ways that it can happen, but when you can't stand outside, when you can't be in Sacramento anymore, you have to think of really creative ways to make sure that the voices are still in Sacramento.
I mean, I would totally agree. And I would say that, one of the things that's different after our organizing is we specifically wanted to build a list of women of color. A lot of the online activist groups that are familiar to us have a largely white list, and we've built a list of 75,000, mostly women of color in California. And we did that really because we wanted to build a virtual network and a political home for those who subscribe to our values and want to do some work. Leveraging that network, we tapped into the volunteer and the energy enthusiasm over the last few months to do text out the vote events. We reached 3.7 million women of color in the battleground states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Georgia. But the thing that's really important here is that we have to explicitly build an online community with a sense of kind of shared value and purpose in California to be able to take that statewide effort and turn it on to supporting candidates and issues that we care about here at home, as well as tapping our time and resources to apply in other places like in Georgia. Because I think you're right. If we look at the creative ways that the organizers on the ground in Georgia have been doing things, there's a lot that we can learn from that. In California, because of our size and our wealth and all of that, is used to being out front. But I'm going to tell you, my experience is that if we look to Georgia for some ideas about what we've even seen in the this last election, what we're going to need to see in order to turn out voters virtually, Twitch the vote, happy hour, virtual happy hours, Divine 9 events. These are all events that we should be looking at as a model in Georgia and replicating. It's going to look and feel different for Californians, but it's really how we need to organize, not just through this special election, but to continue to build power in our state.
What I would add, I mean, I would say that we have all had to get much sharper and clearer about how we're using our platforms. You know, ACE is now using our digital platforms to figure out how we're doing popular education that we otherwise would have only done with our members. It's been very useful in that way. And I never have appreciated more the value of being on the doors than when we're not able to be on the doors. You know, if you look at places like Texas and Florida on the ground, they say, you know, the Trump folks never got off the doors, and that made a big difference on the ground. And our organizers are saying, we want to figure out how we can continue to really be in communication with folks and be safe. And so lots of groups are starting to talk with epidemiologists and understand what would be the right protocols. You know, how can we actually show up as real essential workers, as organizers are, but in the safest possible way? When are the times that we say we should just not be on the doors in this moment? When are the times we can say we can be on the doors and in this particular way? Because that, especially now when we know we've got to show up for each other and take care of each other, and because of the deep digital divide, which I also appreciate much more now than I did before, if we're not actually taking the responsible paths towards connection, we are just finding that it's very difficult to grow. And so we might be able to find ways to have, you know, text bank or tablet banks that we can loan out and et cetera. But what about the people that we're not connected to? How do we reach them in this moment? So that's what we're at ACE really starting to dig into and think about is like, if this is around for another year, we cannot lose the connection with our folks that need to be with us for another year. So that's where we are.
All right. So I am tasked with landing us on time. So we got 10 minutes. I'm going to ask each of you to take 2 minutes, and I will stop you after 2 minutes. We got a bunch of funders on, and we're all in this together. So if you could take 2 minutes to share what funders need to know and do now, given all that happened. If you want to do touch on whatever initiative piece you were talking about, but feel free to add on other stuff. I will start with Elisha.
So one of the things that I think is really powerful in this moment is all the, you know, the great organizing we saw in Georgia and the great organizing in Arizona and so many other places. And we know for that to continue to happen, that takes collaboration and that takes, you know, deep trust between organizations. And so being able to fund organizations to do some of that deep work, I think is really important. And then if I think too about some of the explicit work that we do, we have a pretty large sub-grant program to 12 organizations, but a lot of the funders who fund us to do those sub-grants, you know, they have to be program specific grants. And what I've been thinking about is like, how powerful would it be if we could give those sub-grants as GOS grants? Because what people just need from us is the data. They need the data to prove the point they're trying to make, right? Like our data just helps make the case. And so, you know, how powerful if more of that work of intermediaries was able to be done with more trust in the organizations who are on the ground doing the work, doing the organizing.
Thank you. Aimee, want to go next?
The big lesson is that if you invest in Black-led multiracial organizing, we have a chance to get our issues and our candidates and we have a chance for success. And this kind of investment needs to look like identifying the organizers on the ground, the organizations who have C3, C4, even PAC infrastructure, and making sure that they have the resources. I saw in the chat, someone was talking about Arizona. Arizona had a whole collection of organizations that were funded year round to focus on voter registration, engagement issues, and then candidate and campaign work. And that's the infrastructure that needs to be developed. Looking at the power of Black women, in particular in California, and deepening our impact in terms of elevating us as an electorate and making sure that you know, our voices, our organizing is elevated, but actually we're speaking to Black women and Black women as part of a larger women of color movement. In California, women of color are more than 1 of 4 voters, and we're overwhelmingly progressive. I don't think we have yet to see the organizing and in the investment in focusing specifically on women of color We saw that with data. We need data, we need polling, and we need organizing on the ground in order to tap literally the millions and millions of women of color that will drive victories, so that we can win on a Prop 15, we can win on a Prop 16 when we're clear about who are the voters who will deliver that victory, not just in Georgia, but here in California.
Thank you. I'll add in my 2 minutes and then go to Christina and Dorsey. I'd say that we've been, with my other hat, we've been relatively successful in getting individual donors to give political money to Black and Brown, API, Muslim-led political actions that are rooted in the C3 and C4 community groups that C3 folks fund. The thing that I would share with Black funders is the next piece that needs to happen is taking advantage of those political wins. So in this case, when there's a candidate win, making sure that the groups in that region or jurisdiction are ready to co-govern with that newly elected person. So for example, in Contra Costa, where the groups through political means supported the reformer district attorney, Diana Becton, African-American woman there. So that was entirely robust political investments. C3 funders did not rush in to fund the groups to then co-govern with her, because they took over the DA office. That required them not mostly to be in opposition to her, but actually co-governing with her. We saw that same lack of investment in co-governance in San Francisco when the local groups got Chesa elected, the DA there. So the next thing that happened just now was the DA race in LA and Holly Mitchell winning. And those are two places where the local C3 groups that just had those political wins with their other hats need to be taken to scale so that they can co-govern with those people they just elected. Otherwise, doing the political work isn't worth it. They now got the opportunity to co-govern, and it's now C3 funders' responsibility to rush in with money to bring them to scale. And that's true in Oakland with Carol Fife and all the places where we've had those kind of wins. Then the C3 groups become important again because they need the scale to co-govern with the newly elected person. And with that, let me pass to Christina.
I think I would want to underscore Aimee's call for funding Black-led multiracial organizing that's deep and on the ground and values-driven. I want to say that the need to really figure out how we get progressive revenue next year is critical, and we need y'all to not just like invest in it, fund it, but also be sort of, you know, co-conspirators in it. Y'all need to be like progressive whisperers into whoever it is you have influence on to help make that happen. I want to say that housing and the upcoming eviction crisis that is looming is going to be so impactful on Black communities. And so if you all are not currently engaged in figuring out how we are moving toward actually forgiving the rent and the mortgage debt that people are going to be saddled with, and the other kinds of housing debt, that we will see a continued decimation of our communities. That is a critical piece of work, and one that we will be co-governing with Carol on to figure out how to move, at least in Oakland, and hopefully like sort of impact other regions in that way. And then the last thing I will say is civic engagement, as I was saying before, is not just showing up on election day, getting people out, you know, during election season. Civic engagement does have to happen at a robust scale all year long. And it is not just about the political education. It's also about the moving people in the streets. It's also about the policy development. It's also about the figuring out how to maximize our C4 influence in the legislature. So I, just want to encourage y'all to be really open-minded and thoughtful about what it is that we are trying to move and how you can move your dollars around to meet those needs.
Thank you. And last, Dorsey.
I'm almost at a loss for words, or at least I need to measure them. But I actually think that at a certain point, we need funding to be invested in structure and development of formerly incarcerated led organizations in particular. Because, it's no way that I sit at a table or walk into most places where things are accessible to other people that's still not accessible to me because I have a felony. So at a certain point, I would suggest that we think about how do we invest in the leadership of formerly incarcerated people, and how do we identify those organizations that's led by formerly incarcerated people, because when we get intermediaries acting for us, we don't necessarily get the authentic voice of our community. You know, it would be as crazy as suspecting that men should just be in the position of always speaking in leadership of women. Women need to have that voice and carry that water themselves in part to get what they want. And maybe the stuff that I'm seeking, maybe formerly incarcerated people who are closest to our problems are also closest to our solution, and we need to be supported. And the thing that I really want to emphasize is that we didn't have a whole bunch of money on our campaign. What we had was human beings that was willing to fight and probably take unbelievable chances in the middle of the pandemic to actually get out people to get people to vote for the cause that they actually believed in. Because we didn't have millions of dollars to throw at this apparatus. And I don't think that people are still unwilling to give us millions of dollars to fight any proposition that we would put on the ballot, even though those propositions would serve the interests of the entire community. So if it's anything that I had to say is invest in something, invest in people, that we need to have an investment that shows that that they have a cause in order to meet for my community to move, a cause greater than themselves. And so when we saying we're going to secure the right to vote, that was one thing. When everybody else was talking about we're going to secure people being Democrats, that was a whole different question. So give them a greater cause. And I think that they could serve the community in a much more fundamentally and productive way. And I think that we're missing a part of what added value that we can actually tap into, because people are not reaching deep enough into that particular part of the community.
Thank you, Dorsey. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Summer and Rakiba for having me as moderator, and thank everybody for being on. And let me pass to Summer Jackson to wrap us up.
Okay, well, I was trying to capture some notes, and it was a very, I learned a lot from this conversation, and I really want to thank the panelists again: Aimee, Allison, Christina, Livingston, Dr. Elisha Smith Arrillaga, Dorsey Nunn, and you, Ludovic, for your moderation. I would like to thank our program planning committee, Nicole Giles. Our thought partner behind this program was Rakiba Labrie, who is one of our board members, but also a program director at the the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. And she helped kind of put the panel together. So I don't think she's on the call, but I do just want to give her great thanks for the organizing. We are at a little bit past our time. So I do want to close out with short remarks, closing remarks. We will be sending out a survey, and we will send out some of the resources in the chat. I apologize that we weren't able to get through all the questions, but I hope that the information was useful in your thoughts about how to fund Black organizing to support Black communities and Black-led organizations. I hope you have a wonderful day, and that is it. And happy birthday, Nicole, one more time. So thank you, everyone.